We're live. Hello, everyone. Sorry to start a couple minutes late there. Uh, Welcome to the This Is Not Therapy Hour. I am Brandon Tessers. I'm a licensed therapist, but this is not therapy for so very, very, very many reasons. What this is just an open conversation. It's time that I make myself available to sit here and stream and talk about things. Every week we pick a topic, and lately one of our staff therapists, Margaret Schaus, has been helping with picking the topics and soliciting questions around that topic in advance, especially through TikTok. If you're on TikTok, I feel like such a boomer saying this, and I'm not. I'm a millennial, but I don't do TikTok and I don't know how it works. I got my Twitter, and that's enough for me. Um, but we're doing more and more stuff on TikTok, thanks to Margaret. So you can check us out there, however it is that works. We always pick a topic, but this is really just more of like an open office hours kind of a thing. So for those of you who are here watching this, thank you. I appreciate you being here. I appreciate those of you who are watching this after the fact as well. If you're here watching this live and you're in the chat, writing messages to me, I especially appreciate that, because then that means that I can get a sense of what you guys are actually thinking about, wondering about, wanting to comment or say, rather than just having to make my guesses. And the things that I say impact you, and the things that you say impact me, and we'll go wherever the conversation goes. So we'll start with the topic, but we'll go wherever we go. If you're asking questions or talking about things that take us in a different direction outside of the topic, great. I'd rather it be relevant to the people who are here. What else? Oh, if you're on Facebook watching this, then if you do comment, it'll be attached to your Facebook profile. If you're on YouTube, it'll be attached to your Google account, meaning that's the name that will show up. And if you're on Twitch, it'll be your Twitch account. So keep that in mind. This is a public thing, whatever things you're saying, if there's identifiable information, just know that. And this will be saved so that people can watch it after the fact on YouTube and Twitch and Facebook, I think. I think there's like a capacity, and maybe we've reached that and it's not saving them on some of those anymore, but just, theoretically it's going to be saved. I run a practice, a therapy practice, and an executive functioning coaching practice, two separate things. We have therapists, we have coaches. We do individual, couples, family, and group therapy. Very exciting. We are launching our neurodiversity affirming parenting group starting next Tuesday. And there are some spots left. I didn't think that there would be, but there are. So if anybody's interested in that, please let us know. Check us out at our website, effectiveartistry.com. Or just really generally, if you're interested in any of our services, executive functioning, coaching, individual therapy, whatever, check us out. Give us a ring, a holler, an email, whatever, however it works. I think that's all the stuff that I usually say off the top, or that is important to say off the top. Maybe I'm forgetting something. If I am, oh well. Today, the topic is self-care. And just like last week, one of the wonderful things about Margaret doing this and collecting questions is that I don't really look at them in advance because I don't have to worry about it. And so I get to just see them when they're here. The topic, that's last week's topic. Maybe she texted it to me. I thought it was in the Google chat. Let me see. No, where did it go? The topic is self-care. I know I saw, there it is. The topic for today is self-care and burnout. So before we even get into the questions, just to kind of talk about the topic of self-care and the topic of burnout generally. So first of all, the concept of self-care I find to be pretty problematic, because to engage in self-care requires that you have the ability to engage in self-care. And self-care is most important. As your capacity to engage in self-care decreases, as you get more overwhelmed, more burnt out, you lose access to resources. As your capacity to engage in self-care decreases, the necessity for care increases, including to the extent that sometimes things are so bad that you can't do anything for self-care for various reasons, external, internal, whatever. So the framework of self-care is a little, not a little, it's a lot problematic. It's a way of shunting responsibility onto an individual for their own well-being, and is particularly pushed by larger organizations, um, corporations, places that have lots of employees will do a lot about self-care. Schools will talk a lot about self-care. It's a way of saying, hey, yes, you might be getting burnt out based on the things that you're being asked to do, or the things that you're being exposed to, or the things that you're experiencing, and we don't want you to get burnt out, so take care of yourself. Now, having said that, knowing how to take care of yourself is still a good and valuable thing to do. Knowing how you respond to different things, and when I'm feeling this way, I can do this to get myself out of, is of course a good thing to do. So I'm not trying to say that self-care is a useless thing or a purely like terrible, capitalistic, whatever. It is, and it can be discussed and utilized in that way, but it's still also good to be able to know yourself. So we're still going to talk about how to develop those things. We'll see what the questions all are. But just keep that in mind, that no matter how good you are at self-care, you still need community, you still need relationships, you need other people. There are times and places where if nobody else notices that you need help, or shows up to give you help, or helps you out just by going through the course of their day, even if they don't know that it's helpful to you, there are times and places where if somebody else doesn't do something particular that is helpful or necessary for you, you're just kind of screwed. It's really uncomfortable to talk about, because when I talk about this, I will usually get the question when I say it is possible to be in a state in which you are not capable of even recognizing that you could benefit from help or care, much less identifying what that help or care might be and then going and getting it, and et cetera, et cetera. And the question that I usually get when I say that is, so when you're in that place, what do you do? And the point I'm making is that it can get to a place where there is nothing that you can do. And it's terrifying and it's awful, but people do die, right? None of us have, because we're all here. And part of the way that the brain works and cognitive biases is to forget that that is an option. We forget that sometimes things just don't work and it ends. We don't want to think about it because it's not fun to think about. But this is why I'm pushing, no matter how good you are at self-care, you need to be in relationships, in community, even if the way that you're structuring that is non-traditional. It doesn't have to look like any certain kind of a thing. Even if it is just that you have a neighbor that might notice if you don't come out, that not that you've done anything to build that relationship or whatever. But for human beings, isolation is death. And I'm not talking about introvert, extrovert, and social activities, whatever. I'm talking about, evolutionarily speaking, an isolated human dies. You can't go out into the wilderness by yourself with only the knowledge that you have and the knowledge that you come up with and the abilities that you have, and survive. We need other people. So self-care is important. It does not take away that need. Now, burnout. Burnout is a term that's used for a lot of different things. And so in particular, especially because we specialize in neurodiversity and many people are here for that, autistic burnout is described as a very particular thing that is different from general burnout. Now, these are constructs, right? It's not like, as with all this stuff, it's not something we can look in your brain, look in your body with a certain kind of equipment and say, oh, yep, see, there's the burnout. It's a pattern of experiences, thoughts, feelings, behaviors that we notice trends that when someone's feeling this way, they will often also be feeling this way or thinking this thing or behaving in this way. And when we notice those patterns, we start to name them. So burnout is a construct. It's a name that we've applied to a pattern of things that we have observed. And so while, yes, some people will tell you that autistic burnout is different from general burnout, that's because autistic people who experience the thing that they're calling autistic burnout, when they communicate with other people who experience the thing that they're calling just general burnout, notice differences, that there are differences between the two types, but more similarities in people who are experiencing autistic burnout than there are with people who are experiencing general burnout. And I'm using that as an example, but as with all constructs in all language, it is completely individualized and unique. No two people will experience burnout exactly the same. So we can't actually definitively say, if you're experiencing burnout, it'll be this, 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 and this. Or if you're experiencing this, 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 and this, that's burnout. There are many experiences of something that you might call burnout that you could also call depression, or that you could also call, I don't know, exhaustion, or whatever other terms somebody might use. This is part of the problem in recognizing and identifying these things and then addressing them, is that different people will use different language to describe the experience. But generally, what we're going to be talking about today, as a general definition of what burnout is, we're going to talk about it in terms of resources and sustainability. That you have finite resources. We, people, humans, have finite resources. You have only so much energy, only so much attention, only so much working memory, only so much physicality, right? I can only reach so far and move so fast. And we have to spend those resources to do anything, to live, right? It takes energy and physicality for us to breathe and for our heart to beat. When you're sleeping, you're expending energy. So it takes everything you do, including just existing, takes resources. And some things that you do regenerate or recoup or recover some of those resources. That anything you do takes energy. Some things you do also give you energy, like, for example, sleeping or eating food. And some of that is in like the organic category. And then there's other stuff as well. And maybe we'll talk about that depending on what the questions are, which I really got to get to. What we're talking about with burnout is when you get into a pattern of unsustainable living, where the amount of your resources that you are expending every day outweighs the amount of resources that you recover every day. So, and day is an arbitrary, unit of time here, every hour, every minute, every year, whatever. That as time passes, your total capacity decreases and decreases and decreases, because you spend 100 and you get back 99. Then you spend 99 and you get back 98. And eventually you get to zero. Now, burnout, we're just going to call it for ease of use today, is when you get to zero, more or less, right? That, of course, it's not actually zero because you're still living and surviving. You're still breathing and your heart is beating. So there is something happening. It's not nothing at all, but there's a certain threshold, and that's going to change based on who you are and what you're doing and what you need to do in order to continue to live. Some people, when they get burnt out, can just take a week's vacation. Some people, when they get burnt out, have to be going to work anyway. Some people, like my wife and I and our kids, caught COVID back in the spring. We don't get to stop getting up in the night with the then 7-month-old. We still have to do that. We still have to take care of the kids. Some people, when they get COVID, can just hole up in bed and rest and recover. Some people have to still do things. Some people have to work. And so all individualized, but that's what we're talking about, burnout. It is something that accrues over time after a period of time of unsustainability. Things get worse and worse and worse. At a certain point, it's burnout. Yeah, I want to say more about that generally, but let's get into the questions because maybe some of this stuff will come up. So number one, I feel like even things I do for self-care don't relax me. I am still thinking about all my stress. What other options are there? Well, that's a kind of broad question. If I'm going to interpret that to mean what other options for self-care are there besides the things that I'm already doing? Because if the question is what options are there besides self-care, well, let's answer both those questions. Let's start with the first. If you're saying besides self-care, what is there to do? We talked a bunch about that already in the broad definition. Community care, relationships, getting help and support. It's other people, other things besides just yourself. In addition to that, self-care is generally talked about in terms of things that restore your resources to you, that bring you joy and give you energy and make you happy. But also part of self-care can be looking at decreasing, taking things off of your plate. So not just getting more back, but also spending less in the first place. Because what we're talking about, if you're not burnt out, what we're talking about is we're looking for sustainability, where even if a day is hard, the next day isn't any worse, right? That I can recover as much as I need to cover all the stuff that I am spending. So that can be in getting more back, and that can also be in decreasing what you're spending. Decreasing what you're spending can be done by taking things off your plate, just stopping doing things altogether, or looking at individual specific ways to take whatever activities it is that you're doing and make them cost less so that you can still do all those things, but get through the day without having spent as much. That's kind of the broad answer to the broad version of the question. If you're saying what other options are there besides the things you do for self-care, well, obviously I don't know what things you're doing, but I would say just because something is self-care for somebody else doesn't mean it will do the same thing for you. Meditation here is a great example, especially for the phrasing of this question. I'm still thinking about all my stress. Some people will meditate and they clear their mind and they let go of their worries. And at least this is the way it's described to me. Meditation does not work for me in that way, or at least I've never figured out or had an experience of it working like that for me. For some of us, maybe we could do it differently if we knew how, or if it was taught to us differently or whatever. But for some of us, if we sit there and try and clear our mind, all we're doing is getting our thoughts to become more and more intense, more and more of our focus. Because if I'm meditating, I'm sitting still or laying or, whatever it is that I'm doing, that means that I don't need to pay much attention to my body and my surroundings. I might even be closing my eyes. So I'm not paying as much attention to the sensory input and the actual physical environment, which means this space really opens up for my thoughts. I think way more when I'm meditating. And if I'm anxious or upset or the things that I'm thinking are bothering me in one way or another, then meditating makes that worse for me. So just because something is supposed to be self-care, what that means is whoever is suggesting it to you has either found it to be helpful for them, or they've also been told by somebody else that it is helpful. Doesn't mean it will be for you. So try it. But if it doesn't work, that's not self-care. Stop doing that thing. Go do something else. If you're doing something and all that happens is you keep thinking about your stress, don't do that thing anymore. Try and find something else to do. I think it's useful to look at this in two ways. And I'm considering talking a little bit about the neurobiology. I don't know, I'm not an expert in biology and neurochemistry and all that. I know a good amount of it, but I certainly couldn't sit down and talk in the nitty-gritty details of every specific little thing. So it's possible that I'm getting some things incorrect here. But one thing that I think is worth noting is that dopamine, which is the neurochemical, I'm blanking. It's what we associate with pleasure, the experience of pleasure, joy, accomplishment, a sense of meaning. It's the reward chemical, right? Neurotransmitter. That's the word I'm looking for. It's the neurotransmitter that we associate with the experience of joy, meaning, accomplishment, pleasure. We call it the reward chemical, sometimes colloquially. Well, when dopamine is released into the brain, cells then are motivated in that cellular way. They are moved, they're instructed to start breaking glucose down in the process that translates glucose into energy. So you have glucose floating around in your brain, in the blood, and then the dopamine actually does energize you because it actually does take some of that glucose and turn it into energy. We don't do that at a maximum level because you need to have, you can't just use every piece of glucose that's in your body for everything. So this is where we get all that other stuff we talk about in executive functioning terms, cognitive miser and all those things, that there are reasons that the brain and the body are balanced and adjusted to use what is necessary, what is helpful, what is useful, and no more, because we deplete the resources and because we damage the system. Just like if you're lifting weights, every time you do it, it uses up some energy, which needs to be replenished, and it damages the system. And until that system has a chance to repair, it's got a diminished capacity. This is like some of the biology behind cognitive miser theory. In other words, when you are enjoying something and you feel energized, it's not just a feeling, you are getting more energy. So I like to break this stuff down into two categories. One, I like the old Greek philosophy terms. One we call hedonic. That means something is enjoyable in and of itself, that the experience is enjoyable moment to moment. It's not about what it means or what it's getting you to, or it's just, this tastes good. That is enjoyable. This feels good. That is enjoyable. Talking to my friends is fun. That's enjoyable, right? It's all that's hedonic. The other category is, we use the term eudaimonic. I think I just put those on the same side. So this will be hedonic and this will be eudaimonic. Eudaimonic is the joy that comes from meaning. And that doesn't mean that you have to have deep experience of like, yes, this means something to me. It means that you have connected whatever thing it is that you're observing or experiencing or doing to something else. It could be that the other thing you've connected it to is a concept like charity. So even though, lifting heavy sacks and boxes and moving them into trucks and whatever is a miserable experience in and of itself, if I'm doing it for a charitable cause and I care about charity, I can still enjoy it and feel energized by it. The homework that I have to do is not enjoyable, but when I'm done, I've completed it, and that means that I've done a good job, and it gets me closer to my eventual goal of passing the class. So some of this is meaning that it's like connected to a concept or an idea. Some of it's about connecting to your identity. Some about connected to something else that happens later. These things are good to distinguish because hedonic joy replenishes you moment to moment. And a lot of self-care stuff, that's what people will talk about. Take a nice, warm, relaxing bath. That's hedonic. It's energizing. It's enjoyable, the experience, theoretically, not for everybody. But we tend to, when we're talking about self-care, just look past all the eudaimonic joy stuff, the stuff that even though the experience itself can even be taxing, it's still energizing, right? Like, look at people who play like Souls-like kinds of games, Dark Souls, right? That are ridiculously difficult and hard, and people get so frustrated. But the extent to which you get frustrated equates to the extent to which you feel energized and accomplished when you eventually overcome the frustration. So those are the kinds of things that you're definitely going to want to look at earlier in the process, before you've gotten to a place where you don't have very much to give, because you don't want to invest more of your resources into something that needs to be completed to pay off. And that's the big distinction. Eudaimonic stuff, you have to complete it. It has to go the way that you're needing it or wanting it to go meaningfully in order for it to be replenishing. So if, for example, I give myself a goal to write a novel and I write 50 pages of that novel and then stop, I feel bad. I've invested a bunch of stuff into it and I did not get any of the payoff because I didn't accomplish it. In fact, I feel worse because, oh my God, why I didn't accomplish this thing I was trying to accomplish again. But if I did complete it, the reward, the joy and the energy and all that stuff at the end is that much bigger too. It's important to note that for that stuff, meaning, you make up your meaning. If you set a goal of writing a novel, well, when you write the novel, when you complete that, you'll get the reward. If you set a goal of writing 50 words, then when you write the 50 words, you'll get the reward. And yes, the more difficult something is, the bigger the reward. So that's some of the reason we want to make these big goals, because man, when it pays off, when I graduate finally, or whatever it is, right? So, but sometimes we don't have the ability to go for that big one when we need faster payoff, when we're at a worse place and need to start cycling in the positive direction, start getting better and more. And so that frees up some things to do even more and better. Then we want to look at very short-term, easy to accomplish things and or hedonic things. And of course, the best is to do stuff that's both. Number 2, how often should someone do self-care? Oh boy. As often as possible, I guess, would be the point. You do self-care every day. And of course, different people use words to mean different things. So it's possible that I'm interpreting this question differently than the asker meant it to be interpreted. But you do self-care all the time. I mean, every single night you go to sleep, probably, most nights, at least anyway, you go to sleep, that's self-care. You eat food, that's self-care. You're giving your body and your brain something that it needs in order to be able to continue to function. So you're doing that stuff all the time. How often? That's as often as possible. All of this is balance, right? Not even balance. I like to talk about it as tension. Because balance gives the impression that there's some way that you could know how to just navigate things and stay in balance and never fall to one side or the other and experience any difficulty. That's not how it works. It's tension. You get pulled in this direction until it becomes a problem, and then you can pull yourself in this direction or be pulled in this direction until it's a problem. And then sometimes you balance those tensions for a good long time and you'll stay in the range in which there are no problems. And then again, you get out. It isn't something that you can complete. It isn't something that we can say, yes, you've done enough self-care. You no longer have to ever do self-care. Or you did self-care today, so you don't have to for another 3 days. There's no way to look at it like that. Instead, what I would suggest is not about how often should someone do it. It's what are the signs that you should be doing more than you're doing on like a consistent basis. And that's where we're back to sustainability. If just in a general way, without getting detailed or specific, if it feels like every day is a little bit harder than the day before, every week is a little bit harder than the week before, you're not doing things in a sustainable way. That might not be something you can change, just to be clear. In our culture, a lot of things are structured around the idea that you're going to get worn down. Hey, and now it's spring break. And you charge back up a little bit, worn down. At summer break, and you charge back up a lot. And then fall, worn down. There are times and places where you have to operate unsustainably because the consequences of doing differently than that are worse than the consequences of operating unsustainably. But if you notice that you're operating in an unsustainable way, explore everything that you are capable of exploring and what to do to change that. So now some specific signs of things like that might be happening. Exhaustion, tiredness, whatever, I would say is the big one. And that's another one of those things that I think is actually more useful to break down into subcategories, but we're going to start with just this big, broad. We all know what it is to feel tired, whatever that experience is for you, and to feel rested. If you're feeling more and more tired, then that's a sign that you're operating unsustainably. If you are thinking things like, I don't know, I used to be able to do this, I used to be able to do that, what's wrong? Why don't I do this thing anymore? You're operating unsustainably. And part of that can be things that are outside of your control. Part of it can be things that are in your control, whatever it is. But for example, anhedonia, which is the technical term for what's mostly associated with depression, which is I no longer find joy in the things that used to bring me joy. That's a sign that you are depleted, either burnt out or on your way to it. If you notice yourself engaging with things that you enjoy less and less and less, you're cutting out more and more of the non-essential stuff. If you feel like there is nothing you can cut out of your life, that everything you're doing must be done, you are either burnt out or on your way to it. Because there should be things that happen in your life on a relatively consistent basis, preferably many times a day, that you're doing just because you want to do it. And if that's not happening, again, might not be something that an individual has much control over or option to change. But if that's not happening, that's a problem. You should feel, theoretically, not should, I shouldn't say should. What we're wanting to feel like is at the end of the day, you want to feel tired and accomplished, that you had a good, meaningful day. You're happy with what happened during that day, both in terms of productivity, which is stuff that you're doing for the long term, eudaimonic kind of stuff. And a lot of productivity isn't, well, I was going to say isn't even eudaimonically joyful, but that's not true, because you wouldn't be doing it if it wasn't like getting your paycheck, or even if it is just preventing somebody from abusing you, it's still meaningful in that way. But, we're getting real esoteric with these definitions here, I guess. I think the easiest way to look at this is, if you feel tired, do some self-care if you can. If you feel more tired than you did before, try really hard to do more self-care or work more of it into your day, or cut things out or make things cheaper, get more help, get more support, whatever. If you're feeling energized, excited, rested, then you're probably doing pretty well, and you don't need to worry too much about fitting in more self-care. How do I know if it's actually working? I'm going to read through all these questions real quick because there are 7 of them, and I'm taking my sweet time with things. And so I want to make sure that if there are things I can address together or whatever. How do I know if it's actually working? Next one is, what other options of self-care are there that you don't really hear about? Baths, reading, and other relaxing activities aren't helpful to me because I still have racing thoughts while doing them. Oh, that's back to number 1. We'll talk about that some more. How can I check in with myself to know if I'm burnt out? What are the mental signs of burnout I should watch for? And if I do a job I love, but I have constant burnout, what should I do? How can I change this? Okay. How do I know if it's actually working? I'm going to answer this one in the same way I answered the last one, in kind of a general way, because I have some specific models and like frameworks that I think are particularly helpful, but I want to start with the language that is generally accessible. The answer to this is the opposite of the answer to the last one, that if you feel good, if it's pleasurable, enjoyable, if it's energizing, then it's working. There is not another metric. And that's part of why questions like the first one and the fourth one, like what other options of self-care are there that you don't really hear about? It's part of why those things are problematic, because we're teaching people that self-care can be defined by engaging in a particular activity as opposed to how you feel about a particular activity. If you're doing something and it's not enjoyable or pleasurable to you, at least in the sense that you think it's meaningful and therefore you feel accomplished and you get some joy from that, like, yeah, I did this thing, or I'm closer to my goal, or I'm a good person, or whatever, right? If it's not giving you any pleasure or joy or anything like that, then it's not self-care. It's not helping you. At that point, it's just another chore on your list, another task that you've assigned yourself. And it's probably making things worse, actually, because you're trying to force yourself to do it because it's another thing that you're thinking, I should do this. It would be good if I did this, but then I don't. Working out is a very, very common one that gets put in here, where people will say, I know I should work out because if I do, I'll get more energy, I'll feel better and whatever. And that can be true. It's not always true. It definitely can be true. It matches many people's experiences. But if you're not working out and then you're just saying, well, I'm not, it makes it worse then. I didn't do the thing I was supposed to do, as opposed to what I would prefer that somebody think when that happens is, okay, even if that theoretically would be beneficial to me to do, I don't have what it takes. I don't have what it costs for me to do it right now, which means I need to engage in some other form of self-care that is something that I can do, that I have access to, given the state that I'm in, including, the physical environment, what I have access to, right? In other words, if you think self-care is a list of things and either none of those things work or none of those things are things you have the option to do or some combination of those things, then you feel stuck, like you're just screwed. You're broken and there's something wrong with you, and oh well, too bad. That's your life. That is not the case. Self-care means doing things that bring you joy. And there are other ways to define it, but we're looking at it from the experiential way. Like, for you to know for yourself if it is working, it's that it feels good. And overall, like in a broad pattern kind of way, if you know you're doing enough of it, if you know you're living sustainably, or even better, recovering, which means that you're recovering more in a day than it takes you to get through the day so you can build back up, which is why recovering from burnout is, well, one of the reasons that recovering from burnout is so, I wanted to swear there, is so hard, is because it's not just about adjusting things so that your life becomes sustainable and you're getting back each day what you put out each day. You have to shift things so that you're getting more than you're putting out each day so that you can get back up and up and up, and then shift into being sustainable at a point where you find some balance, right? Some that you feel good about. Yes, if my life continues in this way, great. Because what happens with burnout for most people is it gets worse and worse and worse and worse, but it does stabilize somewhere down here, because if it gets any worse, then things are going to get real bad. I can't continue to function in terms of feeding myself or doing the things that I must do in order to make money so that I can afford to pay rent or whatever those things are. Yeah, that was the sixth question, mental signs of burnout. So we'll get to that. That's how you know it's working. If an individual thing, you know it's working if it feels good, if it is enjoyable, if you want to do it. A pattern of things, it's if preferably you're getting more, that every day you're like, today's better than yesterday was. I'm moving in the right direction. But at the very least, to feel like, yeah, today's about what yesterday was. Okay, didn't get any worse. I'm going to come back to that number 4, because if I'm going to list out a bunch of stuff, I want to save time. I want to see how much time we have left for that. How can I check in with myself to know if I'm burnt out, and what are the mental signs of burnout I should watch out for? I'm trying to think of a metaphor for this. So not everything is, well, nothing is binary, that it either happens or doesn't happen. It happens with a certain frequency or to a certain intensity or to a particular extent. Of course, there are things that don't happen at all, and if they do happen at all, you can say, but it's more useful to look at that intensity. Because, for example, if I stub my toe, if I'm talking and I stub my toe, I might, in that moment, very likely stop talking. I might stop mid-sentence. Nothing else can exist for a moment because, man, this really hurts. And then it fades, and then I can kind of come back to an awareness of the other things I was doing. Whoa, sorry, what was I saying, or whatever. I also might stub my toe in the exact same way, same force of the kick, same angle, same like hardness and sharpness of the thing, exact same stub of the toe, which therefore theoretically would cause the exact same amount of pain. But if that's happening while, instead of having a conversation, I'm running from a bear, I'm not going to stop running from the bear to say, stop, oh, this really hurts, give me a second. I'm going to keep running. In fact, I might not even notice the pain. It might be that later when I'm safe, then I'm like, man, my toe hurts. Why does my toe hurt? What happened there? Must have something. And I know that sounds ridiculous because we're not usually running from bears. If you are running from bears on a frequent basis, there are some changes you should try to make if you can. But it happens all the time. You ever notice a bruise on yourself and like, where did that come from? Or you wake up with an ache, or you wake up and a muscle is sore and you're like, what did I do that made that? Your body would have theoretically been giving you signs. If you got hit hard enough that it causes a bruise, even if you bruise easily, your body felt some pain, unless there's some kind of nerve issue or nerve damage, right? Like the sense was there. But if you were engaged in some other thing that your brain was determining was more important and therefore more worth paying attention to, you might not have noticed the pain. Does that make sense? I'm asking, does that make sense? And there's nobody here to tell me. What I'm trying to get at is intensity. The intensity of an experience is partly about the characteristics of the experience. What is it that is happening, and how does your body detect, sense? How does your mind sense, deal with what is happening? Part of what affects the intensity of an experience is the extent to which you pay attention to the experience. There are things that could go unnoticed completely, or could become your whole world to the point that reality ceases to exist. And that's why I started with the toe stubbing, because that happens sometimes. When you stub your toe, your eyes are closed. You're not anywhere. You're just in pain. You live in pain for a short period of time until it stops hurting, right? The amount of attention that goes to something, the amount of cognition, thought, awareness, working memory space that goes to something can fluctuate, even if the thing itself doesn't change. So in terms of what are the mental signs of burnout you should watch out for, that's really, really difficult, because metacognition, which is the skill, the ability to monitor your own state, to check in and observe, how am I thinking? How am I feeling? Is usually one of the first things that you're going to pull resources from when you're getting depleted. You're going to pay less and less attention to yourself. Not always, but typically. That's part of the reason that this happens, is because as things are getting worse, your ability to notice the fact that they're getting worse is decreasing. So things have to get much more worse for you to notice it. But by the time they get much more worse, your ability to notice it has gotten down a lot more. So this is a great question. How do I check in with myself to know if I'm burnt out? What are the mental signs of burnout? Because if we do this, if we develop this language, we can change how your brain prioritizes this information to make it so that metacognition, for example, is prioritized and other things decrease. But I can still monitor myself and see how I'm doing and have a more accurate read on myself. If I'm burnt out, so that's an arbitrary categorization, right? I'm going down at a certain point. We're going to put a threshold and say, yes, this I'm calling being burnt out. I think what most people generally are saying, but who knows, but I think this is my guess, is that when people are talking about being burnt out, I think what most people are saying is, I have noticed that my life is diminished in some way from what it used to be. I have memories of doing things more or being happier or whatever, but that's not happening in my life now. So it's a comparison to the past, with the past being preferable. The future is bad. So that's got to be true. But that could just be it's a bad day or whatever. I might not call that burnout. So usually also true is that it is consistent for a good period of time. Maybe just a couple of days. It depends on the person. But I think typically if someone's saying that they're burnt out, it's probably been weeks or months that they've noticed, man, things used to be better and now they're worse, and it's still worse, and it's still worse, and it's still worse. The distance time-wise from when things were better is getting greater and greater and greater. And then third, I think that typically when people are talking about burnout, what they mean is I am at capacity, that just getting through my day takes everything that I have. I don't have any extra leftover ability to come up with new ideas and try new things and change my life right now. I just got to survive. Like I said earlier, if you examine your day, a specific day, or like your daily habits or whatever, if you examine a day and try and look at what can I cut, what here is unnecessary, what can I get rid of, what can I pull back, scale back on, and you can't come up with anything, I would say you're burnt out. And yes, this is subjective, right? Some people will say, no, I can't stop calling my mom every day. She really needs me to check in with her. And another person will say, yeah, okay, I can stop calling my mom every day, right? But that's part of it. It's individual. It's unique. That's what I keep trying to hit on, is don't compare your experience to somebody else's. That's not what matters. If you do, then you get into oppression Olympic stuff. You're not burnt out. I'm burnt out. I experienced this and this and this. Oh yeah, well, I'm burnt out. I experienced this and this and this. And if you get into that competitive kind of, my burnout is real burnout and yours isn't, or I qualify as being burnt out, you now have value in feeling bad. It's, if you felt better, you lose that status, that ability to say, no, I can't do that thing. Because what we're wanting to do is to be able to say, I am electing to give that thing up because I can and because I am burnt out. So I'm giving it up. But sometimes people are in positions because of the way that other people have structured things around them, or sometimes because we've internalized stuff where it's, I'm not allowed to quit unless things are really, really bad, at which point we're now, A, not going to address any problems until they get really, really bad, and B, are incentivized to look at things as though they are really, really bad. That doesn't mean that we're making them seem really bad when they're not. It just means that if I actually make things any better, or if things get any better, I'm now losing something in addition to gaining something. So it makes it harder to get better. Much preferable, not always possible, but it's much preferable. So I don't feel like I'm not phrasing that correctly. It is very preferable. There we go. Man, I'm like spacing out on words today. it is preferable to feel as though you have agency in this process and not a lack of control. If you feel as though you have no agency, you're probably burnt out. I would recommend watching behavior more than looking for mental signs of burnout, because metacognition fluctuates. Same reason that if you're taking psychoactive medication, I recommend observing behavior rather than your own experience, because theoretically that medication is going to change the way that you evaluate your experience. That, for example, the first time you take ADHD meds, you might be like, oh my gosh, this is focus, whoa. And then a year in, the comparison is now to an experience that's more than a year old. And so it doesn't feel the same, even though you might be behaving the same, like moving through your day the same. This is very subjective, and this is just I'm giving a personal example because I want to point out like how individualized and varied this can be. I know for myself, and it's taken some time. Honestly, I should have said this at the beginning. I am coming out of burnout right now. I was burnt out. I don't feel as though I am burnt out anymore, but I'm definitely not back to my the way that I want myself to be moving through my life. I think I'm above the threshold, but only very recently got above the threshold of what I would consider being burnt out. One of the things that I notice is when I am tired, when I'm exhausted, when I'm depleted, burnt out, whatever, everything seems darker. Even in my memories, I'm like, when I remember a thing happening, even though logically I can say, well, that was at 5:30 in July, it would have been bright outside, it feels like twilight in my memory. This is going to sound ridiculous, but I have fairly deep set eyes and prominent brows. And although other people wouldn't necessarily notice, I very much notice the asymmetry of my eyes, the fact that one is quite a lot bigger and higher in my face than the other. Part of that is because when I get tired, things start to fall. It takes energy to keep my eyes open and my eyebrows up. And that literally impacts the amount of light that comes. When I'm getting through my day like this, my eyelashes, man, it's hard to even I don't know. I'm going to try and talk. I don't think I can talk in the same tone of voice when making my eyes like that. That I do actually see less light like this. It's more blocked out. That's interesting. I've never noticed that before, that I can't use the same tone. I'm sure I could develop the ability to, but maybe not. So just pointing out all the quirky little ways that even things that seem kind of abstract and esoteric, my memories feel darker, could be connected to actual real physical things, that as I get tired, I do get less light in my eyes. So that's what I'm saying. It's good to be able to check in on the mental signs of burnout, but it's best just to know that you want to look for signs of burnout, and preferable, if possible, to look for observable things that even if you are tired or energized or whatever, you can still definitively say if a thing happened or in what way it happened, not necessarily how you felt about it. If I have a job, if I do a job I love, but I have constant burnout, what should I do? How can I change this? Your job is definitely not the only reason that you might be burnt out. And even if it is the only thing that's, the tipping point, right? That without your job, you wouldn't be burnt out, but with it, you would. There are still other variables. This is part of that same thing, why I think it's problematic to talk about self-care and burnout in this way of burnout is this, self-care is this, because then people are trying to say, am I allowed to call this burnout? Yeah, if you're burnt out, you're burnt out. If you love your job and you're burnt out, then either there are elements of your job that you love and elements of your job that are problematic, in which case you want to start looking at that, separate that out. What are the parts of, even if you overall love it, net, it's a positive in your life, but it's still burning you out, then there's got to be something else going on over here that's taken a lot. And you can see if you can decrease this or increase this or whatever, right? But again, if it's a net positive, if overall you enjoy your job more than you dislike your job, then it's likely that if you're burnt out because of other things that are going on. That could be things like medical issues that are getting in the way of your ability to have energy. part of what I learned that started helping me to get out of burnout is that I had a B12 deficiency, which is, is the vitamin that, I don't know, impacts the nervous system. We don't need to get all the details, but literally parts of my feet started going numb was the first sign. And I got tested with a B12 deficiency, and now I take a B12 supplement. I've been doing it for 2.5 weeks. I'm telling you, this is very recent for me. So medical things, organic things can impact that. Maybe you're not sleeping well or enough or whatever. Maybe you're not eating the things that you need to be eating in terms of quantity, in terms of quality, in terms of what nutrients and vitamins or how much you enjoy it. There are other things that are impacting it. There's nothing that you love and have to give up. If you love a thing, it's not, well, okay. Again, love can mean a lot of different things. So we should clarify that. I'm using love to mean enjoy. I love my job is not usually, people aren't using that word to mean love. Like they say, I love my child or I love my friends or whatever. It usually means I enjoy my job. It's meaningful, it's purposeful, it's enjoyable. I feel like I'm good at it and I'm doing something of worth, right? If you love something in that way, it is not the thing that is making you burnt out. Now, it can be costing you a lot, but it's got to be giving you enough to be worth it for you to experience it that way. And that can be part of the problem here is some things you enjoy so much that you pour so much of yourself into them and you can lose track of, ooh, that's probably more than I should have put into it because even though it's enjoyable, I still have to do these other things that I now am going to have to really kind of push and dig deep and exhaust myself to get those things done. So you can look at scaling back. You can look at separating parts of your job, the things that you do or the ways you engage with it, and see if you can get more of the good, less of the bad, or bring costs down of individual pieces of it. Or you can look outside of your job, look at other things and say, what else might be costing you more than it's worth, or what else might be getting in the way of you being able to recover as much as you need to be able to recover. Having said all that, you might also love another job more. So if you can, and probably if you're burnt out, you can't. But if you can look around and say, even though I love my job, that doesn't mean I have to do this one. I would love another job too, theoretically, and I might even love another job more. So don't get yourself stuck, trapped in. All right, we have 5 minutes left. So I'm going to real quickly run through the framework I think is most helpful for tracking this stuff, and then give a couple examples of like kind of lesser known self-care kind of activities. I call this energy management. We as people tend to be very clear about time. I'm going to go real fast because it's easy to measure. We have clocks and we have words, an hour. You know what that means. I know what that means. It's very difficult to measure energy. It's very difficult to even talk about it. What is it? It's clearly it's more than one thing because sometimes I'm physically like ready to go, but my brain is just depleted. At other times I'm like, my brain is running a miles a minute, but my body is done. So it's complicated and blah, blah, blah. And we don't need to get into all that because what you can do is just make up your own scale, your own language for yourself. I'm going to give the examples that I use, but you can change anything here because it just matters that it's meaningful to you. I call it energy. You can call it whatever you want. I use a scale of 0 to 100. And I recommend to people at first, just check in with yourself randomly, whenever, anytime you think of it, just check in. Would I say that right now I have 20 energy, 80, 33, whatever? Even better if you can do it on a regular basis. Again, I recommend first thing in the morning, as soon as your brain is online, not first thing when you wake up, but first thing once you're like actually awake and online, to then check in and say, how much energy, where am I at? 80, 75, 100, whatever. That scale is going to shift. It's subjective. It's arbitrary. It's okay. You don't need to worry about it. Some days you're going to wake up and be like, yeah, 100. And then the next day you wake up and it's even better. You're like, oh, I guess this is 100 and that was 90. Or you just say, maybe my scale goes to 110 or whatever. But if you do that consistently, you'll start to track over time. Am I going down? Am I going up? What are the trends? And you can start to, without having to do anything in particular, your brain will take that information and start to look at correlations. Seems like I tend to be lower energy in the fall and I tend to be higher energy in the spring. Or it seems like I tend to be low energy during the week, high on the weekdays, or I seem to be low energy on days after I drink, or I seem to be high energy on days after I drink, or whatever it is for a given individual. So you track that. And that's a good way to be able to start to see, okay, yesterday took more out of me than I got back. So today I'm going to try and get more back than I spend. And if I can't, okay, well, then I got to look, can I do it tomorrow, or when am I going to recover from this? Including sometimes it's, okay, I'm going to schedule a vacation or a break for myself because I think I can get through about another 3 weeks without things getting too bad. But at that point, I better take a big break and recover a lot, or whatever you can do. That's my recommendation for tracking it, and also tracking how I know if I'm doing enough of it often enough. Is it working, right? It's just, how do I feel? You can get more specific. I get more specific with myself sometimes of this kind of energy versus this kind of energy, because sometimes there are things like, for example, I've noticed for myself, if I'm feeling like cognitively depleted, but my body's doing just fine, a lot of the time that has to do for me with dehydration, which is why I now have giant water bottles in my house, in my office, filled with water all the time, because I think about drinking, but if it's not right there, I forget to go get water and actually do it. So you can separate and get more specific. Some things that are lesser known that might be helpful: anything you enjoy, role-playing games, video games, watching TV. Now, pay attention. Some of these things energize you more, some less. I talk about the float, which when you get so low that you can't really afford to do any of the things that are more rewarding for you, all you can afford to do is stuff that gives you enough back to keep you going, but doesn't get better, and you just kind of exist and float until it's time to fall asleep, which, by the way, would be another big sign of burnout. If you're doing that float thing where it's like, I just spent a large portion of my day doing something that was enjoyable, but I don't feel better at the end of it than I did at the beginning of it, that's the float. And that's a sign that something's not going right. Engage with your art, dance. Some things I have found for myself: keeping the windows in my house open as much as possible so that there's sound and noise and smell coming in from the outside to draw my awareness back to my body. I play Beat Saber on the Oculus Rift every morning now because that draws my awareness to my body. I make it difficult enough for myself that in order to keep going, I don't have anything left over to think. I start dancing and moving and swaying in ways that I don't even like monitor myself doing. So engaging in anything that draws stuff to the environment. If you're feeling burnt out more cognitively, if you're feeling burnt out more physically, then you need to look at changing your diet. And I don't mean eating less or going on a diet. I don't even necessarily mean eating healthier. Sometimes it's, you need to eat more sugar. It's maybe you need more carbs, maybe you need whatever, because it's individual to you. So you just start experimenting with, but that's where we always come back to what sounds good, what is enjoyable and pleasurable. But then you can also track, okay, eating a bunch of sugar sounds good, I'm going to do it. And then track how it goes after that, because sometimes it sounds great in the moment, and then an hour later, you're like, oh, I wish I hadn't done that. So track it, but just explore. I got to go. Somebody's waiting for me. It's a minute past. Shoot, I wanted to say more things. Well, I'll be back next week, same time, Wednesday, 1 to 2 p.m. Please keep coming back. Appreciate you all. Thank you. Bye.